Hello everyone, this is Dr. Raisha Noorani, Croydon GP. Welcome to Behind the Stethoscope, and we're here on our next podcast episode. I'm here with Dr. John Spicer. Dr. John Spicer is a long-time GP from Croydon. He was a GP trainee in 1981. Went off to do a gap year, he tells me, and then came straight back and has been a working Croydon GP since. I know John from when he did his head of school for the GP school. He was my head of school, which he probably doesn't remember. Very laid back John, sitting down, telling us his plans. And so welcome to the show. Thank you for having us.
Well, it's very nice to be here, Ria, and thank you for the invitation.
Not at all. So John, you've done loads of things in your time as a GP. Tell me a bit about them, or maybe even start prior to that. Tell me about your journey to become a GP, and what led you to that point.
It's a good question. I found myself finishing back in the late 70s what was the equivalent of house job, or the equivalent of foundation rather, and not knowing what on earth I wanted to do as a career. So I was in the Midlands at the time, spent a couple of years doing respiratory medicine, a bit of research in that field, and then decided I didn't like hospitals very much, but I did like being out in the community. So at that stage, one could construct your own programs of SHO training. So that's what I did in Birmingham and district. And then, quite by chance, ended up in Croydon for my final year at what is now the East Croydon Medical Centre, as what would be called an ST3 now. And I sort of quite liked Croydon, really, and didn't actively decide to stay, but it sort of happened. And as you said, I finished training, was offered a very good job, and made probably a bad decision not to take it, and went off travelling the world for a couple of years before my kids were born. But came back to a job in Woodside, in South Norwood, in January '85, and I've kind of been here ever since, actually.
Amazing. Did you go back to, so when you decided it was a good job but you decided not to take it, what was it like? You finished ST3. That's quite a difficult decision to make. On one side you've got all this adventure and the ability to be a free spirit, and finally, I guess what a lot of ST3s are thinking is coming off all the loopholes you need to do to become a GP, and then you've got this amazing offer on the other side. What was that like?
Well, I think we're at these sort of transition points in life, aren't we, from time to time?
Yeah.
And I think I was 28, maybe, something like that at the time. And as I said, the kids hadn't been born, and one was offered an opportunity which would have been financially great.
Yeah.
It would have been joining a very good, active training practice, who I got on with very well. And one might think it's actually slightly counterintuitive to ignore that offer and say, actually, I haven't seen enough of the world.
Yeah.
So before settling down into a career properly, and at that stage maybe having some children and doing all the other things you do at that age, I and my wife thought it was actually time to get moving. So I took a job in Australia doing some out of hours, which was the worst job in the world. But before that, we were traveling in Asia for 6 months. And then while we were away, I did a bit of psychiatry in New Zealand. I'd already done a psych job in Birmingham.
Yeah.
So that was quite fun, and almost took up psychiatry, but didn't in the end. Travelled a bit more, and then came home and did a long locum in Southwark.
Okay.
By which time I got the job in Croydon. Obviously, I knew people in Croydon from having been there as a trainee.
Yeah.
So it seemed a natural sort of step, but not maybe a typical step for the time.
Yeah, I think it's a really brave step, to be honest, because the easier thing to do is just take on the role, have the children. It's quite nice to take a break from that, and maybe sometimes You need that, don't you? You need that kind of moment to work out your values, and that's probably worth a lot more in terms of when you look back at the experiences in years to come. I think that's really impressive, but not the easiest of choices.
I
What?
think that's true, actually. And in retrospect, looking back on it at my time of life now, I certainly don't regret it.
Yeah.
And I can understand why people do gap years, which is more usually done between school and university. I just happen to do it between GP training and adult life, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What was it like? What was general practice like back in 1985 when you joined?
Now it's an interesting one. It's an issue I reflect on quite a lot. Um, it was different. I was a salary partner for the first couple of years and then became a profit sharing partner. It was essentially the same in terms of the job that one does, the relationships one develops with patients, the scope of the job. There weren't as many people in our team. We didn't even have a practice nurse at that stage.
Oh, wow.
That came along about 5 years later in 1990-ish. The only people we had in support were receptionists. There wasn't even a practice manager. So it was a very, very different, slightly oldie-worldy version of primary care. The word primary care was completely unknown.
Okay.
And yet it did enable you to find your clinical feet and work in a team of sorts. It wasn't a team that a young GP now would recognise. But it did enable you to find your clinical feet and develop relationships both with patients and colleagues in a formative way at the time, if I can put it that way. But it was a very different creature from primary care now.
I'm just having a moment because I don't know how our practice would work without a practice manager. We probably wouldn't have any money left. And did the GPs, is that kind of the management and the business side, did they get involved in that side of things, or was it simpler?
Well, it's certainly true to say it was simpler because money came in from. Now, I'm trying to recall what the name of the body was. I think it was Croydon Health Authority, or maybe the Family Health Services Authority, or one of the many configurations of NHS bureaucracy we've seen over the years. Whoever it was sent us a cheque every quarter, more or less, based on the work that had been done. And that was the capitation and the extras for vaccinations and various other things. So actually, the business side of it, transactionally, was a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Now, in my health centre, we don't own the property, so that made life simpler from the organisational point of view. We just had a chunk taken out of it for rent. If one owned one's own property, then obviously it was a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
I can't speak from experience about that, but I know that many colleagues do and have found it quite a useful thing to be able to own your own property.
And I guess patients, what were patients? You never know because I haven't been a GP at that time, so you never know if it's the good old days or if it's a bit of, we're slightly skewed when we perceive time and how it changes with general practice. But we talk a lot about sort of the Amazon type of patient, the ones that want things and want things instantaneously. Was that still something that you'd see? Was that a theme that you'd see in patients, those back then, or was that something that was rare and less common?
I think to a large degree, patients' expectations were different, and in a manner of speaking, could be said to be less in the sense that of the Amazon doctor that you're hypothesizing there, and we probably managed a caseload that was equally intense as it is now, but it was rather different. And of course, it depends on which part of Croydon you're in. In the northern part of Croydon, we're probably looking after more disadvantaged populations than down in the south. And one of the things about that part of Croydon, particularly central Croydon, is that we did have the various waves of refugees that came through Luna House arrived on our doorstep. And over the years, I can think of many different waves of refugees. For example, at one point, about 20, 25 years ago, there were a lot of patients from Central Africa who came in as refugees. And my French is good enough to consult in, not brilliant, but it actually proved quite useful with people coming from Francophone nations like that. So, my feeling on this is that patients don't change. They have the same needs and wants as ever, but they do vary a bit over time. The onset of the Amazon patient or an Amazon doctor, I'm not quite sure which, is a recent phenomenon.
Okay, interesting. And then you sort of said the intensity was still quite there. Do you compare it to what the intensity is like now? Is it more clinical? Is it the intensity now is just about, I mean, the issues I look at now is sort of time and meeting all the appointments that patients want. What is the apart from the refugees, what sort of intensity would you have? Would it be clinical? Would it be other things?
It was pretty much all clinical then. There just wasn't very much management going on. So the idea of spending many man or woman hours at a PCT meeting or something like that just didn't happen. So the demand was all clinical. And, if I think about it, I think general practice has always been a busy job where there's never been enough time to do what you need to do for the patients in front of you. And that hasn't changed, I wouldn't say, since 1981. It's just modified slightly in the content of what patients present to us. But the need is still there, and your essential descriptors of what you do as a primary care doctor actually haven't changed very much.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because you sort of look at it and you just think, oh, it feels like we're getting busier and busier and busier. But you actually, it's really helpful to sit back and reflect and look at it from a different perspective. I guess you didn't just do general practice; you did other things. Like I said, you sort of went into training, academia. I missed out from the introduction, but you teach ethics and clinical law at St George's University. How did you fall into that? What led to going down that route?
Well, if we take education first, like I said, I joined my practice in 85, and in 1990, the then course organizer, what is now a TPD as you are, happened to meet me at a meeting and said, had you thought about going into education, John? And I said, no, I hadn't, because I'm one of these people who sits by the river and watches it flow and occasionally picks things off it, rather than necessarily being very assertive about career intentions, for example. So this made me think about it, and I said, that's an interesting idea. And actually, this guy was called Clifford Floyd, and he was one of the TPDs at the time as well.
Yeah.
So I joined him as a course organizer for Croydon VTS in 1990 and did all the various group skills training and, training to be a trainer and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I carried it on for 12 or 13 years. And as you well know, it's a great job because it gives you links with your trainer colleagues and universities and all that sort of thing. And I carried that on for about 12 or 13 years until I was invited, again, I hadn't put myself forward for this, to become an associate dean for the then London Deanery.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, it was suggested that I apply for a head of school job, which I did. And in 2010, became head of school for London Deanery as was. It morphed into HEE a couple of years later. So I did that for 7 or 8 years, and it was a very stimulating progression, both understanding education, how to apply it in primary care, how to develop some innovative projects working with our multidisciplinary colleagues, all of that. And I'm still teaching now, occasionally teaching trainers and other educators in primary care to do the job. The ethics side of thing was, in a way, was a bit different. There was a project where GPs could be supported. This was back in 89, 90, something like that, to do a master's and get some time out of practice.
Okay.
So I did that, and I did a master's in law and ethics at King's, and that led me into an academic strand as well. And as you said, I became eventually a teacher at St George's, and I do that occasionally now, as well as in other places, in Gozo, an island next to Malta, and for the Society of Apothecaries, and occasionally for VTS schemes, and whoever wants some ethics in their soul, really.
We always need a bit of ethics in our soul. Were these things that you were always were you always interested in teaching, or did you sort of say you picked it up from, you were invited, or it's just things that you could pick? Is that what happened? You'd pick things up, put them down again, look at something. Is that how you kind of see your career flow over that time?
Yeah. I think there's a difference, isn't there, between doctors who have clear ideas about how they see their career progressing and where they want it to go. And to some extent, they may be successful or not. And obviously, life is punctuated with all sorts of complications along the way, which may get in the way of those aims. That's never been my style. I've never had an idea when I was 30 about where I would be when I was 40. When you see questions like that on appraisal documents, I always fall blank. But on the other hand, various opportunities have come along, and occasionally I've seized them, and I've not regretted any of that. So I find myself now, maybe towards the end of my career, almost 70, but still enjoying the day-to-day work of general practice and academia as well. So I'll do it as long as I am not cognitively failing.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. There must have been points, John, in that career where you just thought, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Was this the right choice? Did you have those? You're
Oh,
very
yeah.
calm. You're very calm and serene, but what were the punctuated bits that you're talking about? Tell us a bit. How did you stick it out despite those?
It's a very perceptive question, Raisha. And yes, a lot of us are like ducks, aren't we? Swimming serenely on the surface, but underneath our legs are flapping wildly. I guess there have been moments like that when the working week just was far too busy. And, maybe it wasn't organized by me properly. I can remember a time when I was a course organizer at Croydon, and I would go off on a Wednesday to do the sessions that you know very well, but would have to rush back to surgery to see a few patients afterwards. And the working week was incredibly busy, and the kids were still fairly young, and there was just too much going on. I think one of the great things about being a GP is that to some extent you can adapt your life. So I have made the decision, for example, in 2010, when I became head of school, to stop being a partner in the practice. Okay. And so therefore I could leave the responsibility for HR and management and strategic stuff behind. There was plenty of that at London Deanery. And yet continue to be a clinician, which I quite enjoyed. And if the truth were known, the management of a practice or a PCN or anything like that is not really my forte. Okay. There are people in Croydon who are much better at it than I am, and I'm quite happy to leave that to them. So I think part of this is adapting your working week and making the decision to cut down sessions in X in order to increase them in Y. And somebody, an old colleague of mine, very wisely gave me some advice once, which was, if somebody asks you to do something, which happens all the time, doesn't it? You say to yourself, okay, that's fine, that sounds interesting. If I'm going to do that, I need to put something else down. Now, that might be, your clinical sessions. it might be a bit of management work you've got on, but to be able to graduate your working week so it's sustainable.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I always think when you come out of medical school, or even when you're in medical school, you say yes to every opportunity, don't you? Because you're keen to get things in your CV and you're not sure where your life is going to lead. And it's a skill to say no, or actually, I'm finding that this is adding a lot of value, but I feel like I've done this for a while, I understand this, and I maybe lost a bit of interest and I'd like to put this down because I think medics and GPs, we like to stay loyal till the end, and it's nice to be able to put things down, but it's a skill to learn how to make that decision and kind of go, actually, maybe the intensity of what I'm doing right now is too much.
Yes, I think that's right. And I suppose now I'm in the slightly luxurious position of being able to do that a lot. And I stopped being full-time about 3 or 4 years ago. And now I'm working probably 3 or 4 days a week. That may change over the next year or two. We'll see. I think that piece of advice that I just mentioned is very wise, and I would counsel colleagues to think about it as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. What does your week look like now? What is it like?
Okay, so I work one day at the practice still, sometimes a bit more if they're short, or if I or they need to change the days around. It's pretty flexible.
Yeah.
I'm usually teaching one day a week, occasionally a bit more. I'm usually writing. I'm going through a fairly productive phase writing articles with colleagues and stuff. A day a week, maybe. And then, the rest of the week is my own. I'm learning my mother tongue, which I've wanted to do for years, which is not easy. And I get more time to play the guitar.
Amazing. What's your mother tongue, John?
It's Maltese, which is essentially Arabic. And it's very stimulating doing that later in life.
Yeah,
I can recommend that too.
love that. It's a whole new thing, isn't it? Learning a language. Amazing. So it sounds like a really nice balance between, working life and then the stuff you enjoy. Is that a bit of the secret of keeping going? Because it's a long time. And the fact that you want to continue working and still be sort of professionally active, what keeps it going? Is it just that balance? Is it the things that you picked up, things you enjoy along the road? Yeah, what keeps you going?
I think, professionally speaking, yeah, it's things I picked up along the road, and I have the luxury of being able to choose between them.
Yeah.
So if somebody says to me that, why don't we do a bit of research on this and write it up? If it sounds interesting, I'll do it. The other thing that's happened recently is because I've always been fairly active in our college.
Yeah.
And for our faculty, I've been the chair and the provost and various other roles over the years. Excuse me. And just recently, I've gone on to RCGP Council. Now, there are people among us who are very good at this kind of medico-political activity, either for us as GPs or for the BMA or wherever. Now, I've never really been engaged in that too much in the past, but it's become a very interesting side issue. And so that took up another day last week. And there's going to be various, subcommittees and things that come from that. And my term for that is 3 years. So that's going to last another 2 3/4 years at least.
Yeah.
And again, that's an area of activity colleagues can take if they're interested in that sort of thing. And it's a way of linking up with like-minded people who have, how can I put this without sounding pious, a belief in the value of primary care and how it should be developing. And as we all know, the politicians have not made that easy throughout my professional career, I should say, apart from a couple of periods. And at the moment, primary care is in a difficult spot, and we need people to argue for it and believe in it.
We do, we really do. And I always sort of come back to this because we have this, the GP is such a vital role, isn't it, to society? It's just interesting to see how much it's changed over those years. This example, this kind of image you have of your GP and then maybe a practice nurse at the practice to this GP that's, supervising pharmacists and paramedics and going to meetings and management and looking at quaff points and where we're at. It's a very different GP. It's quite a whirlwind of how I guess people would have imagined their careers going. How do you think it will keep going, John? What do you think the future of it looks like for general practitioners?
That's a really good question, Raisha. I mean, I'm worried about where we are at the moment. I think the relative underinvestment for primary care, which has ever been thus, we still have about 7 or 8% of the NHS budget, and it should be a lot more to allow us to do the things we should be doing. I worry about the workforce situation, which I had some knowledge of when I was working at HCE. I think the very positive things actually are the multidisciplinary nature of modern primary care. You've mentioned some of our colleagues, our pharmacists and our physios and our nurses. We could not possibly do the job without the multidisciplinary teams we have now. There's a few ripples in the stream at the moment. We've got to sort out the physician associate situation, which I think we will. But I think if we had an administration politically who was willing to support primary care and the traditional values and descriptors of primary care, then actually our future is rosy. I think we need to be showing to our new GPs, our new young GPs, that actually the job in the way that I've described it has a good future. And I think given a fair wind, it does.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's scary and it makes you feel a bit of trepidation when you think of what the future might look like. But at the same time, it also, I guess, opens up these doors of there's potential to make it change. It's exactly what you said right at the beginning when you said the beauty of it is you can be sort of autonomous and be flexible and you can kind of make your career go a certain way. But to some degree, I think GPs have a lot of power and we can make the future of primary care. I feel like we're at a point where we can actually dictate the future of primary care and the way we want it to go, should we all work together and be able to do that. But maybe that's naively hopeful. I don't know.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that we need to work together.
Yeah.
And that's one of the interesting things about being part of our college. And yes, if that does come out that way, and more than anything else, we persuade our young workforce that there's a great future in front of us, and enough people actually want to join us in primary care, which is partially a job we have with undergraduates more than anybody else, I would suggest. Then that adds to the potential positivity. Yeah. Let us hope it comes out that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess looking back at when you were head of school, we talk about sort of recruiting GPs. We still have huge numbers going into GP training, but they don't stay in general practice. Was that an issue when you were head of school? Was that something that was always kind of there in the background?
Yeah, so this is all about retention, isn't it? And it's trying to find ways in which we who are seniors or managers in practices can actually produce the kind of soft landing for our new MRCGP holders and young colleagues who want to join our multidisciplinary teams. So it's partially about the NHS context and the political context, which I agree we have some influence on, but it's also about us creating practices that new GPs want to work in and remain in.
Yeah.
Now, I think we can do that in various ways, so as to make working in a team, a stable team, more attractive than working as a locum
Yeah.
in a hub or in an out of hours situation or in some salami sliced version of primary care. I think we need to continue to offer the whole package and demonstrate to incoming GPs that this is a good way to work.
Yeah.
And we offer patients the best deal, and we offer ourselves the best deal. I think that can be done.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. It is that team spirit that is so essential to having a good working life. You know, having your colleagues, the ones that you spent years with, they're becoming your friends, which it changes your complete sort of how you value your work, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right.
That's really interesting.
So I guess from my point of view, because I'm no longer a partner and I'm not involved politically, I have a limited role locally in doing that. But as a member of the wider college, and remember, we are now 55,000 strong, our college. We are the largest discipline within medicine by quite a way. And we should be aware of the fact that all the evidence suggests systemically that a country with a well-functioning primary care system has far better population health outcomes
Yes.
Than countries that don't. And we have a unified, socialized system, which most other countries dream of. It's not perfect. We don't have as good outcomes as we could do. But if you talk to colleagues in Europe and the wider world,
Yeah.
the system that we work under is the subject of actually considerable envy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We need to celebrate that.
We should celebrate that. Absolutely. And sometimes I think we lose it with all the negative headlines and the constant pressure. It's quite nice to sit back and talk to you and go, oh, yeah, absolutely. This is exactly what I went into general practice for, this, and what I admire about the general practice in the UK. It's good. It's a good reflection. I like that. I guess my question is, if you were to give advice, and I'm going to leave it at this last question, really. If you were to give advice to GPs now, so someone like me or younger than me who's going into general practice and is really fed up and they just can't see, the wood for the trees in front of them. So what would you say, John? What would you say to keep them going?
Oh, that's a difficult question, Rosha. You've saved the most difficult question to last. I guess maybe to reflect on some of the issues we've covered here. The fact that the job, excuse me, that we do in primary care has value.
Yeah.
It has epidemiological value, if you like. The fact that you can find a supportive, useful, effective team to work within.
Yeah.
We have to be careful here and admit that not all primary care is perfect, but that a young GP coming into the system can actually find a practice that's better than another one, and celebrate practices that actually do their job well. The fact that the traditional descriptors of primary care, continuity, relationships with patients, first access, all of those things which you learn about when you're doing the exam, are actually really important to your sense of professional identity and professional well-being. And that if you keep those going over time, actually you will end up having a very stimulating career as part of a community of practice. And actually, I think to a large extent in Croydon, we've got that. We are, the London Borough of Croydon has a population of 400,000, something like that. It's a very big borough. We're a very sort of local kind of borough in Croydon. We have our own DGH. We have a good relationship with the other authorities within Croydon, and there's opinion formers and leaders who've done that masterfully over recent years. We have good connections with a number of medical schools. We have good connections with the wider London medical scene. I think there's everything to be said for staying in Croydon, actually.
I absolutely agree with you. I remember when I finished, so like you, Croydon trainee, decided to work closer to home and just found myself being drawn back because Croydon has a real identity, and there's so much diversity. And I mean, in every form, where you've got one part of the borough which is much more privileged, but other places where you have extreme deprivation, and having, the ability to kind of go from one part of the borough and learn to other parts where it's a mini sort of microcosm, isn't it, in itself? And I think,
Yeah.
and it works really well. I mean, primary care, I've always found in Croydon is actually really robust and innovative, and I guess there's something about a borough which, when you're limited by funds, you find better and more clever ways of doing things, which I think is quite exciting. I've always said that about Croydon. But yeah, that's really helpful.
I think we're in agreement there, Raisha.
Good. Thank you, John, for spending some time with us and sharing your insights. It's been really interesting to hear how general practice has changed. And actually, it's been really interesting to see that we will always have a role as GPs, and we're so influential in sort of primary care, not just our careers, but in primary care and what that means in terms of our relationship to our patients. So I really appreciate that. A quick reminder to everyone to like, follow and subscribe so you keep up to date with all the podcasts. Thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure, Raisha. Thank you.